Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So before I even begin today, I just want to thank everybody who listens to my videos, because with this video, I am going to be hitting 1 million views. And for someone who's only been around for a year and a half and only has 8,000 subscribers, 1 million views is really good. I think the reason why I only have 8,000 subscribers but 1 million views is because I tend to tick people off a little bit. And speaking of ticking people off, what I'm going to talk about today is the health of both the comic industry and the manga industry in relation to what I said in my last video, which really ticked people off, because my last video was about the death of anime and manga. And it is my assertion that what happened to the comic industry is now happening to the manga industry. And my point being that we should take a really good look at that as it unfolds right before us so that we don't make the same mistake again. We can look back at comics and do the same thing, but to look at it as it unfolds in the manga industry is something else, and I think that will give the key to understanding how to build a healthy industry in the future, whatever that industry be. Now, quickly, when I talk about the death of anime and manga and the same thing happening to anime and manga as happened to comics, I'm not talking about these quote-unquote progressive people taking over the entire industry. I'm simply talking about how bad storytelling became the norm. And this simply took the industry and drove it into the ground to the point where these progressives finally took over in the comic industry. But I can see the same thing happening in the manga industry right now. So the way I'm going to start is by looking at the comments that I got in my last video. Now, there was one set of comments which were dead on, and they were telling me that I shouldn't be using my pitiful little bit of knowledge about anime and manga to try to argue anything. And that's exactly right. I should not have done that. That was me simply trying to take my argument and make it more relevant, because my previous video to that only got about 3,000 views because I was speaking very, I suppose, intellectually and not connecting them to anything. So I shouldn't have done that, I agree. But that leads straight into the second kind of comment that I got. A kind of comment that went like this. You don't know the Japanese culture, therefore you simply don't understand manga. You don't know the Japanese language, therefore you don't understand. You don't know Japanese humor, therefore you don't understand. You don't know the history of manga, therefore you don't understand. You don't know the distinction between kinds of manga, therefore you don't understand, etc., etc., etc. All of these comments were based upon the idea that I needed some special kind of knowledge of either Japanese culture or manga itself in order to understand the story. Now, first of all, I can see why people would tend to go in this way with their thoughts, because I was trying to mix in some of my individual experiences with manga and anime and try to mix that into my argument, and that was the problem. It would probably generate in the listener's mind the idea that I was arguing in an inductive way. That is to say, to take these specifics, these individual situations, and try to abstract from them something larger. But that's not what I was trying to do at all. I was actually trying to argue deductively. That is to say, there are these universal principles that govern storytelling, and if we go downwards from them, we can see that these are bad stories, and bad stories make a bad industry, and a bad industry will fall. And secondly, I want to bring up the fact that when I argue in this abstract way, I am using universals. I am trying to be deductive. That's the way I argue, because I believe that art and the art of storytelling is connected to a universal, is connected to something that we can all understand and is unchangeable. And therefore, it sets up some rules for good storytelling, and we can all know those rules, and we can apply them objectively in order to understand whether it's a good story or not. Now, on that front, I'm not going to go into the proof entirely for that today, because I simply don't have the time, and I hate to shift the burden of proof, but to give you just some small indication of why I think there is a universal that art is connected to, I want to very briefly talk about another comment that I got in one of my videos a couple of weeks ago. Someone saying, "Why should I listen to anything you have to say? Art is subjective." Now, I would say the first part of that statement is completely true. You should not listen to anything I have to say. I am not an authority on anything. All I seek to do here is to bring up ideas. And then, hopefully, you can take those ideas, you can apply them to reality and see if they're true or not. I am certainly not some authority on high to be handing down truths to anybody. But the second part of that comment, where it said, art is subjective, I disagreed with emphatically. And why? Well, the simple reason why is because if you're making the statement, art is subjective, you're making a statement about the nature of art. And not only are you making a statement about the nature of art, but you're making an objective statement about the nature of art. It is, by necessity, as according to how language works, an objective statement about what it is discussing. So this person was making an objective statement about the nature of art by saying that art is subjective. But the thing is that if you can make an objective statement about the nature of art, then art simply cannot be subjective. So the statement itself is self-contradictory. And I'd like to discuss that more in another video, but I'm going to move on for now. And I'm going to talk about something which is going to be very bland and dry, because I'm going to go from a universal downwards to show why the comic industry and the manga industry have failed or are failing, and what we need to do in order to have a healthy industry, no matter where it comes from. And as always, if anybody finds problems with my arguments, please put them in the comments. So my argument concerning the very big picture would be this. We live in a world that has a limited amount of resources. And we also live in a world where there are a multitude of other creatures, including a multitude of other people. And so, living in this world where there are so many different kinds of creatures, so many different people, and we have only a limited amount of resources, we simply have to compete for those resources. And competition naturally flows from the fact that we live in this world with limited resources and that there are so many of us, including other creatures. Competition naturally flows from the nature of reality around us. And so, if we wish to survive, we need to compete. So the question becomes, who gets to survive and how? Well, whoever gets to survive is the person who gets the resources. And the person who gets the resources is the person who can get to those resources more efficiently than anyone else. And to define more efficiently, I would say this person or group of people would use as few steps as possible in as little time possible to get to those resources. So if you have you and me and everybody else, and we all start at point A, and the resources are over at point B, the person or the people who can get from point A to point B with the fewest steps possible in the shortest amount of time possible are the ones who get that resource, and therefore are the ones who have the best chance of surviving. Now, here's the thing. In the realm of human beings, what is the most efficient way to do things? Well, the most efficient way to do things in the realm of human beings is through reason and logic. Now, how can I say this? Well, I can say this because this is the reason why reason and logic themselves were created, or if you look at it the other way, were brought into the realm of human understanding. This is the reason that they actually exist. That is their stated purpose, to get you from point A to point B with order and ease. That is to say, to get you there as efficiently as possible. So if you're at point A and you want to get to point B as efficiently as possible, you use reason and logic. And the reason why, again, reason and logic can do this is because what reason and logic seeks to do is to impose upon all human language, thought, actions, everything that has to do with human beings, impose upon all of that the dictates of reality. That is to say, to take the bigger rules that govern reality and to have them govern even the small things that we use so that we can move, again, as efficiently as possible from point A to point B. Because, of course, the distance between point A and point B is governed by reality. It is set by reality. And so is the terrain. The terrain between point A and point B is governed by reality. So you have to work with reality as best as possible. And again, that's what reason and logic seeks to do. So if we're talking about anything within the human sphere, reason and logic is the most efficient way to do this. And what we're talking about is storytelling. Storytelling is within the human sphere. If you wish to get to the resources of the reader and their time and their money faster than anybody else, you do so by using reason and logic within your storytelling. This will allow you to get to those resources first and give you the advantage over everyone else and allow your story the best opportunity to survive. And the great thing is, we don't even have to apply these rules to storytelling, because that was done over 2,400 years ago. Because again, within the definitions of reason and logic, anything, any idea, human idea that seeks to express itself in material substance, that is called an art. And we here are discussing the art of storytelling. And as I had discussed in my video 2 weeks ago, if you take the basic structure of an argument according to reason and logic, this is the basic structure of a story. The best kind of story, the most efficient kind of story that you will ever be able to tell. Because briefly, your most simplistic form of your rational and logical argument is you have three premises, and of each of these premises there is a subject and a predicate, and when you combine them together you get a resolution where you begin at point A and get to point B with some kind of new understanding. This is exactly what a story is in its most efficient form. You have these three premises, and most commonly this expresses itself within your three-act story. And of each of these premises it has a subject and a predicate. That is to say, your subject coincides with your character or your characters, and your predicate coincides with your plot. This is the efficient way to tell a story. But, as I have discussed that at length 2 videos ago, I'm going to move on to something else which we are concerned with here, and that is the ends of a story. What is the point B for a story itself? Well, as I have asserted many times, the reason why we create stories is they are a representation of reality. Now, in the comments of my last video, I got a lot of pushback on that point as well. They were saying, we're talking about science fiction and fantasy stories. They're not a representation of reality. We're talking about worlds that have dragons, or magic, or people with superpowers. This is not a representation of reality. And I would say that that kind of statement is just plain wrong. This is still a representation of reality, and it is still a rational argument. It's simply that one of the propositions used within that argument is a conditional proposition, an if-then proposition. If this were the case, then the rules of reality would make reality look like this, or make the reality for this person or this character look like this. It's simply a conditional proposition. That doesn't hinder at all the fact that a story is a representation of reality. And we know, as I said in my last video, from very simple argumentation, why a story is a representation of reality. It is because any story depends upon either images or words, or a combination of both, to be told. And images and words are signs. Because if I say the word tree, that word tree is not an actual tree. If I draw a picture of a car, that picture of a car is not an actual car. We know that these things are a representation of reality. These signs are a representation of reality. That's what signs are in their nature, fundamentally. And if every story is made up of nothing but signs, then a story is a representation of reality. And again, to go back to what I have said many of times, the reason why we love stories and create stories is because we're imitative learners. It has to do with the nature of how we learn and why we learn and how we find learning enjoyable. But to finally get down to the nitty-gritty of what I am talking about. If we look at a story, it is a representation of reality. It uses signs. And when you discuss signs in connection with logic and reality, which is the most efficient way of doing things, signs are separated into 2 different categories. We have a natural sign and we have an artificial sign. A natural sign is a sign that is connected with the idea it is trying to express in the mind of the person looking at it through something expressed by nature. And all we have to do to understand a natural sign is to understand the reality that is around us. But you also have artificial signs. Artificial signs are signs that are connected with the idea they are trying to express only through something that is man-made. That is to say, something like language, something like culture, all of these institutions that are man-made. This is how you connect that sign with this image in your head. It is something man-made. And so here's the point. For anyone to understand an artificial sign, they automatically need special knowledge. Whereas for a natural sign, you don't need special knowledge. So the thing is that whenever you use an artificial sign, you are automatically taking more steps than the person who is using a natural sign. And if that is taking you more steps, well, that's inefficient. If that's inefficient, you're not going to be the better competitor. You're not going to get to those resources first, and therefore you are not going to be the one that has the best chances to survive. And the same is true with your story. If your story is using artificial signs instead of natural signs, it is not being efficient, and therefore it is not going to be the one in the end that survives. But this is exactly what almost everyone in the comments of my last video was trying to tell me was the virtue of manga. It was that I and everyone else needed to understand these artificial signs in order to understand this form of storytelling itself. Now, I don't agree that that's the case, but let's say it is the case. If that is the case, and you need this special knowledge in order to understand this genre, in order to understand this form of storytelling, this form of storytelling is not efficient, and someone is going to come along very soon, find a more efficient way of telling the same story, and therefore just supplant this entire industry in being number one at telling good stories. And we certainly know this can happen because this is what happened to the North American comic industry. It got supplanted by manga for this exact reason. You had American storytellers, and they were saying to themselves, look, we're only generating these comics for North American buyers. We don't care about anyone else. This is what we're going to concentrate on. So we don't care if we use all of these artificial signs that you have to be American in order to understand the story. We'll simply do that. And while that might have some advantages, the disadvantage is the fact that they are using artificial signs, and their stories became weaker for it. And this became the go-to of how stories were created by these people, in this inefficient way where you needed special knowledge in order to understand the story. And this inefficiency just grew and grew. And they did not correct this inefficiency. Far from it. They dove headfirst into this inefficiency. They started using the crutch of other forms of media in order to understand the story, which added even more and more steps to understanding the story, and therefore became even more and more inefficient. And this led to, in part, the reason why these quote-unquote progressive people were able to take over comics so easily. Because, as I said before, progressives and their ideology are dependent upon the idea that there is no such thing as a natural sign whatsoever, that everything is made up of artificial signs, and since this form of storytelling was already steeped in these artificial signs, already steeped in this inefficiency, they were able to overlay their own inefficiency on it and think that that was actually going to work for them. When all it did, of course, was to take this diving industry and to put it into a further tailspin. And again, why? Because it's bad storytelling. Objectively, this is bad storytelling. Because they're dependent upon artificial signs use more steps to get to their end point. Since they use more steps, this is inefficient. Since this is inefficient, they are not good competitors. Since they're not good competitors and competition is naturally going to happen, they're not going to get to the resources first, and therefore they're not going to survive. And again, it is my assertion that this is what is happening to the manga industry right now. The fact that I had so many people in my comments arguing for this inefficiency within the storytelling itself and how this was the basis of the entire manga industry shows me that yes, this form of inefficient storytelling is what these people are cheering for. The manga industry could recorrect itself and be more and more efficient in the future, but with these people cheering for this inefficiency and saying we need to be the champions of this inefficiency and this special knowledge, all that they are doing is setting forth the conditions for the downfall of this industry. And this is where I'm going to probably tick a couple of people off, but this is the same thing that is going on right now within the comic industry. When you have these people, these creators of comics, and these people who defend these stories, these bad stories, saying, look, you're not a progressive, you don't understand these progressive ideas, you don't have this special knowledge in order to understand the story, therefore go away. These stories are not for you. Comics are not for you. This is the exact same thing that many of the North American audience for manga is doing to other people. They're saying, hey, guess what? In order to understand this story, these stories of manga, you need to have special knowledge. I have that special knowledge. You don't have that special knowledge. And since you don't have that special knowledge, I'm going to tell you to go away. I'm going to ridicule you until you go away, because you don't have this special knowledge, and this special knowledge is needed for you to understand this type of storytelling. Just as the progressives have made themselves the gatekeepers of who gets to read comics, these fans for manga are becoming the gatekeepers of who gets to read manga and who doesn't. This is, for me, the clearest example of the fact that manga is going to go the same way as North American comics have gone. They are going to tout the so-called virtues of this bad storytelling until it drives them into the ground. Personally, I would love both industries to be as healthy as possible. To have both as healthy as possible and to use the best forms of storytelling possible, we would have each of these industries trying to one-up each other in the best competition of the best stories that you have ever seen. But unfortunately, that's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen because more and more people are abandoning what is objectively needed to make a good story. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like. Hit the shield on the lower right hand corner of your screen to subscribe. and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And hopefully in my next video, I'll get back to some of the, what I'd call ground level things that I talk about concerning comics. And again, I want to thank everybody for the 1 million views that I have gotten so far on my YouTube channel. Thank you very much. All right. I'll see you later. Bye.